So in order to change that, we had to seed and curate stories that met what folks were coming in believing, and then change or challenge those beliefs.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement. We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector. Let's get started. Welcome, listeners, to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. I'm your host, Russ Fanoff, and today I'm joined again by Josh Gryniewicz. Hello, Josh.
How's it going?
How's it going with you? I was going to ask you, and you asked yes.
Great.
It's great to see you again. We were recently at the Bridge Conference outside Washington, D.C., presenting on narrative strategy and storytelling. And Josh had recently launched an interview series here on NPFX about narrative strategy and storytelling. His first episode was released in June. If you missed it, please check it out. And we've been fielding a lot of questions specifically about some of the nuts and bolts of narrative strategy. And I wanted to have Josh back on to dig down and discuss some of the basics and create a little bit of context for some of the interviews that he's going to do that you're going to hear coming up. And so today, we're going to talk about a model that Josh has called the units of narrativity. And we're going to go through the different kinds of elements in that model. And they range from micro story to anecdote to story to lore, narrative, and meta narrative. And I think that understanding this model and how it relates to your fundraising and the work that you do can help you get a better sense of how to incorporate narrative strategy and storytelling into your work. And it enables you to kind of put it into action for your nonprofit. So, Josh, with all of that, are you ready to get down to business and talk about this?
Let's do it. Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. So let's start with the description of this units of narrativity. And listeners, if you do want to follow along, there is a download in the show notes, a PDF that you can download that scopes out this units of narrativity and shows you how all of this looks. It's a kind of a concentric circle model that you can download. So go ahead, Josh.
So the first thing I'll say is that the whole units of narrativity approach and what we refer to as a narrative ecosystem really speaks to our theory of change.
Okay.
And so one of the big things that I like to emphasize is differentiating story and narrative. We hear both of those interchangeably. And so story itself is sort of beginning, middle, and end.
Okay.
It depicts a sense of movement, usually a transition. It could be internal movement or external movement, a road trip or a transformation that somebody's undergoing.
Yeah.
And it's a single unit.
Okay.
Narrative, on the other hand, is overarching. So it's more themes or tropes, and it's cobbled together of multiple little touch points, cultural touch points, multiple stories, multiple anecdotes, lore, and all of that feeds up into narrative itself.
Okay.
So different narratives fuse together to create social ideologies, which is meta narrative.
Okay.
And we are so indoctrinated with so many of these that we don't even know that we're living, breathing, and understanding these as stories that we move around in. And the example I often give, I've done a lot of work in the public safety space, and public safety is just bogged down by a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and misunderstanding.
Okay.
It becomes very racialized. We have an idea in our collective consciousness of crime and so on. And it's distorted from reality.
Yeah.
In the sense that even as statistically crime goes down, our response to crime seems to go up.
Right.
And so when we're talking about our theory of change, we're really looking at, can we identify some of those gaps where the meta narrative is fusing, and then feed up stories of our own, strategic stories that both assert and insert into those gaps and create a new understanding. And that's where our social change work happens. That's where our magic happens.
Okay.
And Russ, a lot of this came out of the work that we were doing around mis and disinformation. So right at the start of the pandemic, when we were just inundated with a confusing, disorienting misinformation, very sticky stories that were, not pro-health or pro-social, and really just disorienting audiences at a time of extreme uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And so we were like, okay, we need an entryway into this to help sort of set the record straight. The stuff is moving so fast, the virus is moving so fast, and the disorientation in our audience is moving so fast. We have to figure out a way to map this and challenge it. And then realized in that work, this applies to so many other areas of social change work and social change storytelling that we're doing. And so that's where that model actually derived from.
Okay. So you and I had this initial discussion going on maybe 2 years ago where you first introduced me to these ideas. Mm-hmm. And I came out of that initial discussion and I very much was a skeptic. And I was like, the way that we've been using kind of fundraising storytelling and kind of positioning folks as the savior or the organization as the savior, that's worked fairly well. Right. And so I'm going to take Josh's idea and I'm going to A/B test some of these storytelling techniques. And to be honest, we don't have a lot of room or real estate in our fundraising appeals to really implement a lot of storytelling.
Right.
But even within some of those limited elements, we were able to see some promising results in A/B testing. And I shared that with the folks who came to the Bridge Conference presentation. And that seemed to give folks some hope, I think, in that you, as a fundraiser, number one, you probably don't have full control over the ability to implement this entire suite of these units of narrativity.
That's right.
And number two, even if you're just in charge of maybe fundraising appeals or just one element of your program, don't let that limitation prevent you from taking those steps of doing something with storytelling to what we call flip the script.
That's right. And Russ, I would actually pull that thread even further, that I would say those outermost rings. Mm-hmm. So what we're talking about here is lore, narrative, and meta-narrative.
Yeah.
No one organization, no one book, no one documentary or docuseries or individual is going to be able to influence that on their own.
Yeah.
So we will never have, no matter how much we want it, as an organization, we will never have control over the narrative.
So let me ask you this. That's an interesting point. And something that I was wondering, as you collect micro stories and anecdotes and stories, and you let your beneficiaries and the people who are the folks that you are engaging in your work, as you let those folks tell the story of the work, are they creating your narrative and your meta-narrative?
Yes. So no one controls the entire narrative. And actually, it's very interesting to have this conversation because the evolution of this model really came out of similar parallel conversations. And so initially, the outermost rung was narrative. And we're like, oh, well, everything just feeds up to narrative. And you have these overarching narratives that, inform how we see the world. And we started realizing and also experimenting with this model that, actually, there is another rung outside of that is, how these ideologies form.
Yeah.
And I'll share a quick anecdote about some of the work that we were doing. We were engaged. Odd Duck was brought in to do some work around an innovation hub that was started in a rural community. And everybody had said, that they wanted it. This was something that was actually clamored for a few years before it was actually built. And they had brought in, experts from IDEO and some of these other kind of like meta design firms to help kind of think through what a hub would look like.
Yeah.
And what they realized right after they, launched it is that they had no takers. And they were like, well, what is actually going on here? And so when we were engaged, we were brought in to be like, to troubleshoot that and figure out, okay, why, when people are asking for this, are they not actually taking advantage of it? And what we found was that people were actually defining innovation in they had misinformation about innovation in two ways. One was they saw innovation as something that happens in the shower. It's a eureka moment. And what are you doing in the shower with me? And two, it was they saw it as sort of technologically driven. They were like, well, I'm not going to adopt a new system. I'm not going to adopt this. I'm better off just doing things as is.
Interesting.
And so when we were able to see that, we said, okay, well, what is the counter narrative? What do we need to do to disrupt where people are thinking about innovation? And so it was things like simply changing the box on a form is a type of innovation that can have dynamic results for a team. A process can be an innovation. A system can be an innovation. And so seeding up stories where those examples were successful and related to this hub. And sure enough, they were able to fill multiple cohorts after we started seeding those stories among the teams that were primed to take advantage of this.
Nice.
Hi, this is Curtis Schmidt, producer of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, then we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM Advancement, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode.
So Josh, you've mentioned story, narrative, and meta-narrative, but there are also three others. There's lore, there's anecdote, and microstory. What I'd like to do is just go down the list of those elements. And again, listeners, if you haven't downloaded that cheat sheet that we have, it's really helpful to follow along with this because it's laid out in this nice graph. But Josh, if you could go through each of those, starting with microstory, which is right in the center of that graph, tell us the difference between each one, maybe compare and contrast, but start with microstory and take us through microstory and go all the way to meta-narrative.
Sure. So a microstory, what we're referring to as the smallest unit of story, although, there could be an argument that memes could tell a story, right? And be even smaller.
Right.
But microstory is usually like the nonprofit social change equivalent of flash fiction.
Okay.
So you're hitting all the same elements of a story. You might have a bit of a story arc, as you mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah.
But this is really your like jam-packed paragraph opening and appeal.
Could it be a testimonial from someone?
It could be a testimonial.
Okay.
What you want is to have in miniature sort of cohesive story piece.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so that's what you're doing with microstory. It's usually 30-second to a minute blurb or a 100 or so word paragraph that just kind of hits all of the same beats as you would a story, but in a very terse kind of truncated form.
Gotcha. And it could take the form of any kind of channel of communication, right? It could be a video, it could be audio, it could be text.
All of the above. Yeah, we're very channel agnostic.
Great. Okay, cool.
Then moving one rung up from that is anecdote.
Yes.
And in anecdote is sort of like a story or micro story, but inside baseball. So essentially, you don't have to give a lot of context. You don't have to give a lot of background information.
Okay.
Whereas with story, even with micro story, there's a bit of exposition that needs to happen to set up the scene, to give a setting, to explain who some of these participants and players are. With anecdote, and the differentiation, Russ, is that we encourage anecdotes as tactics within an organization. Maybe when an organization is going through a cultural change, a rebrand, and wants to speak to its values, its organizational values. So you don't have to introduce, if in this hypothetical, we're all coworkers, we're all colleagues, we know each other, and we know a bit about each other, we can start without any of that exposition.
Okay.
We can remove a lot of that context, and we can just jump into a quick shorthand of what the story that we're trying to tell is.
Okay.
So I think another way to frame it is anecdote is sort of just the action at the heart of your story without having to provide a lot of contextual detail.
Got it. That's great. Okay. And then we move on to story.
And story is what we're all familiar with.
Yeah.
So story is often, again, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It usually hits those beats. It has an arc. And it often has a sense of movement, whether that's movement, internally within our own lives, in our own minds, going through a change or a transformation, or externally, a road trip story, a movement outside in the world. It has that sense of journey to it. And that is often how we define story. And again, it provides a lot of that contextual detail. It provides some of that exposition so that you have an orientation of what we're talking about and where we're going with this.
Okay. So we've got three so far. We've got micro story, anecdote, and story. Those start to roll up and create lore.
Well, so the differentiation between the three outer rings, lore, narrative, and meta-narrative, and the three inner rings, the microstory, anecdote, and story, is that microstory, anecdote, and story are really your tools to influence lore, narrative, and meta-narrative.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Okay. All right. This is getting good.
Okay. I'm glad you like it.
This is great. Well, it's important because it's as a fundraiser, appeal writing tends to be very formulaic. And so when I look at this and it's nice and neat in this chart form, it's easy to fall into that formulaic thinking. So this is a great conversation to have because we're starting to get into the realization that there are some gray areas, right? And there's some give and get.
Oh, 100%. And so part of the curation process of an anecdote within an organization is often to change lore. Lore is sort of the conversation around the proverbial water cooler. It can be shit talk. it can be singing the praises of your ED or anything in between, but that's what forms lore. And the example I always give, we consulted with a health and hospital system who had built a trauma center. All of the data, the evaluations showed that trauma center, needed to be located exactly where it was, and they needed to have all services under one roof.
Yeah.
Everything from the mental health aspect of dealing with trauma to actually having physical therapy. And that's why they built it. It was beautiful chrome, steel, glass.
Yeah.
And the moment, Russ, that the ribbon was cut, it began losing money and deficiting. And so again, when Odd Duck was brought in, it was sort of like, what is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we began to do our narrative work and trying to, again, go through a discovery phase and understand, what we learned was that the community itself recognized the organization, the health and hospital system, back in the days of segregation. It was known as the colored hospital, where people went to die.
Huh.
And so it didn't matter that we were talking to oftentimes the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the people who were alive in that era, who would be using and visiting the hospital now.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't matter that most of the folks who were working for the hospital at this point hadn't even been alive during that era. The entire leadership hadn't been alive. That lore in the community around the health and hospital system brand stuck, and it was sticky enough to pass through generations and still be part and parcel of that organization. So going back to the model, we had to seed successes that the health and hospital system had, including in that area of trauma, that would counter-narrativize some of this ingrained lore in the community.
Okay.
So that's what I mean by we can influence the lore,
yes,
but we can't necessarily control or set the lore ourselves.
Okay. So using that as a jumping off point, let's talk about narrative.
So narrative then is cobbled together of multiple touch points, everything from memes to micro stories to stories, all of the above.
Okay.
So going back to some of the work that we've done in public safety, like the narratives that we have are fed by the entire universe of CSI episodes and Law and Order episodes. And even lawyers will often, real practicing lawyers in the real world will often cite examples from Law and Order. And what that does is it adds to a narrative around public safety that, see, the justice system works and it's flawless. We always catch the bad guys and they get their just desserts. But in actuality, the narrative is much more complicated than that. And there's a lot of other nuances. So taking that, there are alternatives to conventional policing and law and order, community-based, violence interruption programs, restorative justice models. All of these things are aspects, are narratives unto themselves that have influence and should disrupt the dominant narrative around public safety.
Okay, so a narrative can exist on its own, and you may have control over it or may not.
Exactly. And I would say not just can exist, does exist.
Okay.
We are all influenced all the time. Narratives are the cultural oxygen which we breathe.
Okay.
So if we set out with the objective to change the narrative, and oftentimes that's what we do with our clients, right? What we do is actually map the narrative that we're trying to change, and then strategically go about what are the stories and all of the other units of narrativity that we have to curate in order to affect that change.
Interesting. How many times do you get into the work with a client and it is an aha moment for them to even realize that there's this narrative they had no idea that was even there?
All the time. I mean, the innovation example that I gave earlier, that was not on our radar at all when we started.
Interesting.
We came in thinking, well, they asked for this, we built it, and, now there's no takers. Do we need to offer different office hours? What's going on? Right?
Yeah.
But it turned out that it was the story. It was actually the meta narrative, which is that last piece,
mm-hmm.
which are the ideas that form from the stories that we kind of encode into ourselves, and our perception of the world.
Right.
And so the meta narratives around that were, well, innovation is a light bulb moment and it happens in isolation. It's usually driven by an individual and it's technological in focus, And none of those things could be further from the truth or further from the model that the Innovation Hub was putting forward. And so in order to change that, we had to seed and curate stories that counter-narrativize that met what folks were coming in believing, and then change or challenge those beliefs.
Excellent. So, meta-narrative.
Yes.
Is it movable at all? Is it just, it lives on its own? Is it immovable? You can't do anything about it. You live with it. You learn from it. Is that it?
Well, so that's ultimately that's the Holy Grail. That's what we're trying to influence.
Yeah.
We're trying to influence the narrative to influence that meta narrative, to change people's thinking,
right,
and change our social response to X, whatever that may be.
Yes. And
so with the meta narrative, what you're trying to identify is the things like, how are people defining in our misinformation work and a lot of the work that we were doing around vaccines, how are people defining health?
Yep.
Just that fundamental can tell us a lot, can give us a lot of information to then do storytelling efforts to increase vaccination rates.
Yeah.
What are the meta narratives that form around public safety, that racialize crime, that have that paradoxical response where the more crime goes down, the more stories about crime seem to go up in the nightly news, right?
Yep.
Like, how do we rectify that? And how do we get more sensible and practical responses to public safety on the table in the conversation?
Yep. I think one of the areas that you and I have both worked in is gun violence prevention. And that is an absolutely infuriating battle between narrative and meta-narrative.
Yes.
Because it is such a widespread problem and issue in the United States with so many different dimensions to tackle at those levels.
And so inherently misunderstood.
Exactly.
In so many different ways. So many of us have our understanding of the justice system from things like Law and Order. That's our takeaway.
Right.
And so we go, oh, okay, well, that's how the justice system works.
Yeah.
Dun, dun. Right?
Yeah, I get all my information from Dick Wolf, and that's how
End of story.
Right.
Or end of narrative.
Yes. And I go into my thinking on this huge issue that affects all of us because I've watched 18 seasons of this.
And often on repeat and often in one sitting. Yeah.
All right, Josh, that is a wonderful encapsulation of what these 6 various elements are. And what I'd like to ask you next is, how would you go into a client and begin to kind of put these units of narrativity into action and develop a framework for people?
Yeah. So we usually do start with a discovery phase. We have a tool that we use called the narrative framework, which identifies sort of those gaps, that fusion of different ideas that you're trying to disrupt in the meta narrative, and then curate all of those components that need to go into that. So who are the audiences you're trying to influence? What are the messaging and the content that they need to hear from this story? What action do you want them to take?
Is it usually campaign based, or are you doing it at an organization level? Are you looking to work with people who are saying, hey, our organization's messaging is completely off?
Our work, we have used this tool across the board for, rebrands and within an organization to sort of internally get everyone on the same page,
okay,
all the way through to campaigns, different kind of advocacy pieces, all across the board.
Okay, so it's scalable, and you can do it from large to small. All right, so I'm sorry I interrupted, but I wanted to get that down so people have an idea of what it's applicable for.
Yeah, so we do the discovery phase. We try to define the narrative that we're working to change, and then how we need to implement that change. So who are the audiences that we need to be talking to? What channels do we need to be on or active in? What are the actions that we're trying to facilitate for those audiences? What are their barriers to receiving this message? And how do we overcome those barriers? And then ideally from that, what we refer to the core of that narrative framework is a story map. Mm-hmm. And that informs the content that we develop from microstory up to story and beyond.
So typically, what does that engagement look like from start to implementation?
So from start, it's, we have a kickoff, we have, discussions with the leadership team, and then we move into identifying those audiences, doing interviews, ethnographic interviews, collecting all of that, usually doing research on the audiences as well, pulling all of that material together. At the close of the discovery phase, we should have some archetypal stories. So the stories that we're trying to seed in this conversation. And then we've also worked on engagements all the way through where we actually do the story collections and those pieces and produce that material.
Excellent. So, Josh, if listeners are wondering how some of these ideas apply to their nonprofit, how they can maybe have a more in-depth conversation, how would they get in touch with you?
So the best way would be oddduck.io, or just email me, josh@oddduck.io.
Great. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. Josh will be back for more discussions with us and some interviews with folks that he has hand-selected and had some wonderful conversations with. And we're going to talk more about storytelling and continue to dive deep into units of narrativity and how those apply in the real world. And Josh, I want to thank you for joining me again here on the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. We always appreciate having you on.
Awesome. Thanks, Russ. I love being on.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you to our podcast producer, Curtis Schmidt. And thank you for listening to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. The downloads are in the show notes. And if you'd like to learn more, you can always contact Josh at oddduck.io, or you can reach out to us here at IPM Advancement. Thanks so much for listening and have a great day.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.